February 26, 1969. Mekong Delta, near Phu Thuc. The Tango boat churned through brown water at 3 knots, its diesel engines throbbing against the oppressive afternoon heat. Sergeant Adelbert Waldron sat near the bow of the armored troop carrier, his modified M21 rifle resting across his knees. Around him, soldiers scanned the tangled mangrove shoreline, watching for movement in the shadows where the Viet Cong always seemed to be waiting. Then it came. The distinctive crack of an enemy sniper's rifle. Rounds pecked at the boat's armor plating. Everyone ducked, officers barked orders, soldiers strained to locate the shooter somewhere along that endless green wall of jungle over 900 meters away. The boat kept moving, rocking with the current and its own momentum. Finding a sniper at that distance was hard enough from solid ground. From a moving platform on water? Impossible. Waldron stood up. He brought the M21 to his shoulder in one fluid motion, the scope finding his eye like it was magnetized. While everyone else was still searching, he'd already spotted him. A dark shape high in a coconut tree, barely distinguishable from the fronds and shadows. Waldron led the target slightly, accounting for the boat's movement, the wind, the distance. His finger found the trigger. One shot. The figure tumbled from the tree. His commanding officer, Major General Julian Ewell, would later write about that moment with barely contained amazement. While everyone else on board strained to find the antagonist firing from the shoreline over 900 meters away, Waldron simply picked off the Viet Cong out of the top of a coconut tree with one shot. From a moving platform. It was just another day for the man who would become the highest-scoring sniper in American military history. And nobody saw it coming. When Staff Sergeant Adelbert Waldron arrived in Vietnam in late 1968, nobody expected him to rewrite the record books. At 35 years old, he was ancient by infantry standards. The average soldier in Vietnam was just 19. He'd already spent 12 years in the Navy as a gunner's mate before enlisting in the Army in 1968. His fellow soldiers would remember him as quiet, reserved, almost invisible when he wanted to be. He didn't look like a warrior. He looked like somebody's dad who'd wandered into the wrong war. The Marines had the famous snipers. Carlos Hathcock with his white feather and legendary patience. Chuck Mawhinney with his record that would stay secret for decades. These were the men everyone talked about, the ones who became legends even while the war was still being fought. They used bolt-action rifles, took carefully prepared positions, and followed doctrine that traced back to World War II. Waldron didn't fit that mold. He carried a semi-automatic M21 rifle, basically a souped-up M14 that had been accurized by the Rock Island Arsenal and fitted with a 3x to 9x adjustable ranging telescope. It was 44 inches long, weighed 12 pounds, and most snipers considered it inferior to the traditional bolt-action rifles that offered better long-range accuracy. The M21 could hold 20 rounds, but what good was fire rate when precision was everything? But Waldron wasn't most snipers. Sergeant Waldron was our most successful sniper, General Ewell would later write. The general commanded the 9th Infantry Division, the Old Reliables, which had been reactivated specifically for Vietnam. The 9th operated in the Mekong Delta, that nightmarish maze of rivers, canals, rice paddies, and mangrove swamps where conventional warfare went to die. It was a place where you couldn't see more than a few meters into the jungle, where the humidity made your rifle slick with sweat, where every shadow might hide an enemy fighter. The division had established its own sniper school, recognizing that the Delta required different skills than the jungle highlands where the Marines operated. Students learned to shoot from moving boats, to work at night with primitive starlight scopes to make snap decisions in close-quarters ambushes. Waldron graduated from that school in late 1968 and was assigned to Company B, 3rd Battalion, 60th Infantry Regiment, the riverine forces who lived and fought from Navy boats. Most people assumed the old Navy guy would be competent, maybe even pretty good. Nobody expected him to become a ghost story the Viet Cong would tell each other in whispers. Adelbert Francis Waldron III was born on March 14, 1933, in Syracuse, New York. His childhood was marked by loneliness. His parents divorced, remarried, divorced again. Young Bert found solace in the woods around Baldwinsville, hunting alone for hours, learning to read the forest, to move without sound, to make every shot count because ammunition cost money his family didn't have. Bert always told me how lonely he was as a child, his ex-wife Betty would later recall. He was so unhappy in his home life that he spent all his time hunting in the woods. I'm sure that's when he learned his marksmanship. He could mimic wild animal sounds perfectly. That solitary boy who talked to animals and disappeared into the forest was learning skills that would make him lethal 20 years later. He joined the Navy in 1953 at age 20, serving for 12 years as a gunner's mate second class, operating the ship's weapon systems. By the time he left the Navy in 1965, he'd been married 3 times before age 23. In 1968, as the Vietnam War consumed more and more young Americans, the 35-year-old Waldron enlisted in the Army. He went to airborne school at age 35 and earned his jump wings. Then he volunteered for Vietnam and found himself assigned to the 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong Delta, the most alien combat environment in the war. The Mekong Delta was 15,000 square miles of waterways, swamps, and rice paddies. There were few roads, fewer dry places to build bases. The Viet Cong owned the rivers and canals, using them to move supplies and fighters throughout the region. It was a guerrilla fighter's paradise and a conventional military's nightmare. The solution was the Mobile Riverine Force, a joint Army-Navy operation that hadn't been attempted since the Civil War. The Navy provided the boats, armored troop carriers converted from World War II landing craft, monitor gunboats bristling with 40mm cannons and 50-caliber machine guns, and assault support patrol boats that could navigate the narrowest canals. The Army provided the infantry, the 2nd Brigade of the 9th Infantry Division, 5,000 soldiers who would learn to fight from boats and sleep on Navy barracks ships that became floating bases. These soldiers lived wet. They fought in waist-deep water, slept in soaked uniforms, and battled malaria, dysentery, jungle rot, leeches, and venomous water snakes alongside the Viet Cong. They called themselves Westmoreland's Wanderers because they moved constantly, the Mobile Riverine base relocating to different anchorages to keep the enemy off balance. This was where Waldron found his calling. The 9th Infantry Division's sniper school taught him to work from unstable platforms, to compensate for boat movement and river current, to use the ANPVS-2 Starlight scope that turned night into green-washed day. But no training could account for the intangibles Waldron brought: the hunter's patience learned in Syracuse woods, the Navy gunner's understanding of leads and trajectories, and something else, something his fellow soldiers couldn't quite name. He saw things before anyone else did. Threats that were just shadows to other men were clear targets to Waldron. It was as if the forest itself spoke to him in that language he'd learned as a lonely boy, and he understood. By January 1969, Specialist 4th Class Waldron was operating with the Mobile Riverine Force, riding tango boats through the canals, his M21 always ready. The Viet Cong controlled the villages along those waterways, and they'd learned to ambush the American boats with devastating effect. But now there was something new aboard the boats. Now there was Waldron. The night of January 19th, 1969, near Ap Hoa, Kien Hoa Province. Waldron's squad from Company B was conducting a reconnaissance mission in pitch darkness, moving through terrain the Viet Cong had owned for years. Intelligence suggested enemy activity in the area. Intelligence was right. approximately 40 Viet Cong unleashed a heavy barrage of small arms and automatic weapons fire. The Americans hit the ground, returning fire into the muzzle flashes. It was chaos. The kind of close-quarters ambush where snipers usually became just another rifleman, their specialized skills useless in the maelstrom. Waldron made a decision that defined everything that followed. He left the relative safety of his squad's defensive position and moved forward, alone, to establish a sniper position in the open. Using his starlight scope, primitive technology that amplified ambient light but washed out depth perception and detail, he began picking out individual VC fighters in the darkness. The scope showed him shadows moving against shadows, but that was enough. He fired, adjusted, fired again. For 3 hours, Waldron engaged the enemy force from his exposed position. He killed 11 Viet Cong. He wounded more. The others, confused by this accurate fire coming from what seemed like multiple positions, believing they'd stumbled into a much larger American force, began to withdraw. Waldron stayed in position until the enemy finally pinpointed where he was shooting from, and only then did he fall back. He earned a Silver Star for that night's work. 3 nights later, on January 22nd, his unit was moving through an area infested with booby traps when they detected a VC probing force. Waldron went to work again, moving rapidly from one firing position to another across open rice paddies, making the enemy think they faced a much larger unit. By skillfully deceiving the communists as to the actual strength of the American unit, he prevented a night assault. When the sun came up, they counted 11 more dead VC. On February 3rd, a nearby South Vietnamese Army unit came under attack. Waldron moved toward the sound of gunfire and spotted a VC element attempting to flank the ARVN soldiers. He broke up the attack with what his citation called deadly accurate fire. Later that night, he killed a Viet Cong soldier who was collecting weapons from his dead comrades, a shot that required finding a single man moving through darkness in enemy-controlled territory. For these actions from January 16th to February 4th, 1969, 14 sniper missions in total. Sergeant Waldron received his first Distinguished Service Cross, America's second highest award for valor. But he was just getting started. On February 14th, near Ap Phu Thuan, Waldron's squad was on patrol when they observed a numerically superior VC force maneuvering to assault a nearby friendly unit. Once again, Waldron used his mobility trick, moving rapidly from position to position, firing from different locations to create the illusion of a larger force. He killed several VC and broke up the attack before it could develop. 12 days later came the coconut tree shot that would cement his legend. Then on March 8th, at Ap Luang Long Noi, when his company came under attack by a large VC force, Waldron killed so many of the attackers that they were forced to withdraw. His second Distinguished Service Cross citation summarized it with characteristic military understatement. Despite adverse weather conditions, poor illumination, and the pressure of arduous missions night after night, he repeatedly located and engaged many hostile elements, killing a number of the enemy. The citation covered 18 sniper missions from February 5th to March 29th, 1969. By this point, Waldron had developed a reputation as the deadliest sniper in the Mekong Delta. His fellow soldiers gave him a nickname, Daniel Boone. The Mobile Riverine Force operated differently than any other unit in Vietnam. They didn't hold ground, they controlled water. The boats would move through the Delta's arterial system of rivers and canals, launching search and destroy missions, setting up temporary blocking positions, then moving to the next objective. Soldiers would ride the tango boats for hours, scanning the shoreline, knowing that at any moment the jungle might erupt with AK-47 fire or a rocket-propelled grenade might streak toward them. Waldron adapted to this environment like he'd been born to it. He learned to read the shoreline in ways other soldiers couldn't. A branch that didn't quite hang right. A shadow that was too uniform. The way birds suddenly stopped calling in one particular section of jungle. His hunting skills from childhood, tracking deer through Syracuse woods, translated seamlessly to tracking humans through Vietnamese swamps. But it was more than that. Waldron understood something fundamental about riverine warfare that most soldiers never grasped. The enemy had to use the rivers too. The VC moved supplies by sampan, crossed waterways to set ambushes, established camps near water sources. They owned the jungle, but the rivers were contested space. And wherever they appeared near water, Waldron could reach them. His weapon was perfectly suited to this work. While Marine snipers like Carlos Hathcock preferred bolt-action rifles for their superior accuracy at extreme range, Waldron's semi-automatic M21 gave him a critical advantage in the Delta's close-quarters environment. He could engage multiple targets rapidly, adapt to fluid situations, and put suppressing fire on enemy positions when necessary. The trade-off in accuracy at 1,000 yards didn't matter when most of his engagements happened at under 500 yards anyway. The M21's 7.62-meter rounds had enough power to penetrate light cover and still remain lethal. The rifle's 20-round magazine meant he could sustain fire during the chaotic ambushes that characterized riverine warfare. And when fitted with the Starlight scope, it transformed him into a predator who owned the night. Waldron became famous for his night operations. While most soldiers couldn't see beyond their rifle sights after dark, Waldron would mount the ANPVS-2 Starlight scope and hunt. The scope was temperamental, had limited range, and washed out fine detail. But it was enough. He'd spot VC rocket teams preparing to fire on the boats, infiltrators moving through villages, scouts setting up ambush positions. One shot. Usually, that's all it took. The Viet Cong learned to fear him. They put a bounty on his head, $50,000, an astronomical sum that demonstrated just how much damage one man with a rifle was inflicting on their operations. They hunted for him specifically, trained their own snipers to counter him. But Waldron remained a ghost. He never stayed in one position too long, never fell into predictable patterns, never gave them a clean shot. His commanding officers began to notice something unusual. After operations, when they tallied enemy casualties, an improbable number of kills were attributed to single, precise shots at long range. Body counts that should have required platoon-level engagements were being achieved by one man with a rifle. General Ewell watched Waldron work and came away convinced he was witnessing something historically significant. Such was the capability of our best sniper, he would later write, still amazed years after the war ended. But what made Waldron truly exceptional wasn't just his marksmanship. It was his consistency. Night after night, mission after mission, through heat and monsoon rain, through malaria and exhaustion, he performed at a level that should have been impossible to maintain. He wasn't having lucky days. This was just what he did. By the spring of 1969, Sergeant Adelbert Waldron had become a one-man strategic asset. In just 8 months of operations, from late 1968 to July 1969, he accumulated 109 confirmed kills, each one documented, verified by witnesses, undeniable. The number was staggering, nearly incomprehensible. Carlos Hathcock, the legendary Marine sniper, would finish the war with 93 confirmed kills over multiple tours. Chuck Mulhiney, whose record stayed classified for 2 decades, had 103. Eric England had 98. Waldron beat them all in 8 months. To understand what this meant, you have to understand how kills were confirmed in Vietnam. A confirmed kill required a body, or multiple witnesses, or both. In the dense jungle and waterways of the Delta, bodies often disappeared, dragged away by comrades, swept downstream, lost in mangrove swamps. The actual number of enemy fighters Waldron killed was almost certainly far higher than 109. His tactics had evolved into something approaching art. He'd learned to use the boat's movement to his advantage, timing his shots between the rolling waves, accounting for multiple variables simultaneously: wind, distance, target movement, boat movement, humidity's effect on the round's trajectory. When he squeezed the trigger, he was solving a calculus problem that most people couldn't comprehend. On operations, other soldiers would watch him work with something approaching awe. He'd spot threats they couldn't see, make shots they couldn't believe. One soldier recalled watching Waldron engage targets while the boat was taking fire, calmly working the rifle while everyone else was trying not to die, putting rounds through impossibly small openings in the jungle canopy. The psychological impact on the enemy was immense. Viet Cong fighters learned that moving near the rivers in daylight was suicide. VC commanders had to factor the American sniper into their operational planning. Whole sections of waterway became no-go zones because Waldron might be there, invisible and lethal. His fellow soldiers started calling him other things besides Daniel Boone. The Old Man, because of his age. The Ghost, because of how he seemed to disappear and reappear. Some just called him Bert, with the kind of quiet respect soldiers reserve for men they know they owe their lives to. He received 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, a Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars, and a Presidential Unit Citation. By any measure, he was one of the most decorated soldiers of the Vietnam War. But decorations weren't why he did it. When people asked him about his work later, he'd shrug it off, uncomfortable with the attention. It was his job, he'd say, just doing his job. The kills kept mounting. February turned to March, March to April, April to May. The numbers became almost routine in their extraordinariness. A typical report might read, Sergeant Waldron engaged 6 enemy targets, eliminated 5 confirmed. Another day at the office for the man who'd become the deadliest individual soldier America had ever fielded. Then, in July 1969, his unit rotated back to the United States. The war would continue for 6 more years, but Adelbert Waldron's combat career was over. In 8 months, he'd achieved what would take other legendary snipers entire careers and multiple tours to accomplish. The record of 109 confirmed kills would stand as the highest in American military history for 42 years. Until Navy SEAL Chris Kyle broke it during multiple deployments in Iraq between 2003 and 2009. After Vietnam, Staff Sergeant Waldron was assigned to the U.S. Army Marksmanship Unit at Fort Benning, teaching the next generation of snipers. He left the Army in 1970 and found work with Mitchell Werbel III, a former CIA operative who ran a private paramilitary training school. He taught marksmanship to security contractors and trained bodyguards for wealthy clients who didn't ask too many questions. But mostly, he tried to disappear. Waldron never wrote a book, never gave interviews, never sought the spotlight that followed other Vietnam snipers into celebrity. When people who knew his record asked him about it, he'd change the subject. The lonely boy who'd spent his childhood in the woods remained, at his core, a man who preferred solitude. His personal life was difficult. Multiple marriages failed. He struggled with what we now recognize as PTSD, but what was then just called adjustment problems. He worked various security jobs, kept to himself, and refused to be anyone's hero. Adelbert Waldron died on April 18, 1995, at age 62. He was buried at Riverside National Cemetery in Riverside, California, with full military honors. No crowds attended. No television cameras recorded the ceremony. The man who'd been the deadliest sniper in American history slipped away as quietly as he'd moved through Vietnamese jungles. For decades, few people outside military circles knew his name. While Carlos Hathcock got books and documentaries, while Chuck Mulhiney eventually allowed his story to be told, Waldron remained a footnote. Extraordinarily skilled, but fundamentally ordinary. A working-class kid from Syracuse who'd happened to be the best at killing people from long distance. But his legacy endures in unexpected ways. The M21 rifle he proved so devastating became the standard U.S. Army sniper weapon, officially adopted in 1972. His techniques for shooting from moving platforms influenced how riverine and maritime forces trained their sharpshooters. His night operations with primitive starlight scopes demonstrated capabilities that became standard doctrine. Most importantly, Waldron proved something that military planners have had to grapple with ever since. One properly trained, properly employed sniper could impact operations far beyond what their rank or resources suggested possible. In an era obsessed with body counts and attrition warfare, Waldron's one's confirmed kills in 8 months represented an efficiency level that no amount of conventional firepower could match. The lonely boy who learned to hunt in Syracuse woods. The Navy gunner who enlisted in the Army at 35. The old man his younger colleagues didn't expect much from. Staff Sergeant Adelbert Waldron III became death on the Mekong, and nobody, least of all the enemy, saw him coming. His record of 109 confirmed kills in 8 months remains the highest by any U.S. Army sniper in history. And if you know where to look at Riverside National Cemetery, you can find his grave, marked simply with his name, his rank, and his dates. No mention of the record, no indication of what he'd done, exactly the way he would have wanted it.